The courtroom was already murmuring when my husband smiled. Not the nervous kind of smile people wear when they're afraid. This one was confident, relaxed. The kind of smile someone wears when they believe they've already won. Kevin Parker stood across the courtroom from me in a perfectly tailored navy suit, one hand resting casually on the table beside his lawyer. 8 years of marriage had taught me how to read his expressions, and the look on his face told me exactly what he believed in that moment. He thought I was finished. Behind him, sitting calmly in the gallery, was Hannah Brooks, 32 years old, polished, elegant, the company's new digital marketing strategist. The woman Kevin had hired just months after his startup began attracting serious investment. The woman who now watched my divorce hearing like it was a front-row seat to someone else's downfall. Kevin's lawyer had just finished presenting their argument to the judge. According to them, the story was simple. Kevin Parker was a brilliant software engineer who built a successful technology company from the ground up, and I was just his wife, a woman who now wanted a piece of his success. Kevin leaned slightly forward and spoke calmly when the judge asked him about my role in the company. "Emily only wants money," he said, his voice steady. "She never did any real work for the business." The words hung in the room like a verdict already decided. A few people in the gallery exchanged quiet looks. Someone coughed softly. Kevin even allowed himself a faint smirk. But what he didn't know in that moment was that the story he had just told the courtroom was missing one very important detail. And in a few minutes, the entire room would find out. The courthouse in downtown Chicago always felt colder than it should. Maybe it was the marble floors or the tall windows that let in pale winter light. Or maybe it was the atmosphere that came with places where lives were quietly dismantled and rebuilt every day. I sat beside my attorney at the defense table, my hands resting calmly in my lap. From the outside, I probably looked exactly the way Kevin expected. Quiet, defeated, a woman watching her marriage officially collapse. But inside, my thoughts were moving somewhere else entirely. Back through the years that brought us here. 8 years earlier, Kevin Parker was not the confident tech founder standing in that courtroom. He was a struggling software engineer with a half-finished idea and a laptop that overheated every 20 minutes. We met at a small technology exhibition in San Francisco. I had been working as a freelance graphic designer, helping small startups build branding and product interfaces. My job was to take complicated ideas and turn them into something people could actually understand. Kevin's project was sitting on a tiny table in the corner of the exhibition hall. A rough prototype for a software platform designed to help small businesses track inventory and customer data. Most people walked past it without stopping. But when Kevin began explaining the system, something about his idea caught my attention. The concept was smart, really smart. But the presentation was terrible. The interface was confusing. The logo looked like it had been made in 5 minutes. The colors clashed. The website design looked unfinished. Kevin had built a powerful tool, but no one could see its potential because the outside looked so unprofessional. I remember telling him that. He looked surprised for a moment. Then he asked the question that started everything. "Could you fix it?" At first I thought he meant for a price. But Kevin didn't have money. What he had was ambition. And the kind of belief that can be contagious when you hear someone talk about their vision long enough. Over the next few weeks, we kept meeting to work on the project. I redesigned the product interface, created a real logo, built a complete visual identity for the company. Everything that people would see when they first encountered the software. Kevin handled the coding. I handled the design. Back then it felt like we were building something together. Something small, fragile, and exciting. But dreams don't pay rent. Kevin's idea required servers to run the platform, better equipment, hosting services, software tools. Kevin didn't have the money for any of that, so I started covering the costs. At first it was small things, paying for hosting, upgrading his computer, helping with a few bills when freelance work paid well. Then Kevin reached a point where he needed to make a decision. He could keep his engineering job and slowly work on the startup at night. Or he could quit and focus on the company full-time. The night he told me he wanted to resign from his job, We were sitting on the floor of his apartment, surrounded by cables and computer parts. "I can't build this halfway," he said. "If I don't give it everything, it's never going to work." I knew what he was asking without him saying it directly. If Kevin quit his job, someone else would have to carry everything financially. Rent, food, utilities, server costs, every expense that came with building a company from nothing. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I believe in the idea," I said. 2 weeks later, Kevin resigned. And just like that, my life quietly became something very different. During the day, I worked at a design agency creating marketing materials for small technology companies. At night, I accepted freelance projects online. On weekends, I taught beginner design classes through video calls to earn extra income. Kevin spent nearly every hour coding. I told myself it was temporary. One day, the company would succeed. One day, the long nights and empty bank accounts would turn into something real. Back then, I believed we were building that future together. What I didn't realize was that success would eventually change the way Kevin remembered those years entirely. And in that courtroom 8 years later, he had just finished telling the judge a version of our story where I was barely part of it at all. Which is why, when the judge finally turned toward my side of the room and asked if we had anything to add, I slowly stood up. Because Kevin Parker had just told the court that I never did any real work for his company. And in a moment, I was about to show everyone why that claim was about to become very expensive. The courtroom air felt thick after Kevin finished speaking. For a few seconds, no one said anything. My husband sat back in his chair like a man who had just completed a routine presentation at a business meeting. Calm, controlled, confident that the outcome had already been decided. Across the room, Hannah Brooks crossed her legs and leaned slightly forward in her seat behind him, watching me with quiet curiosity. She looked comfortable, like someone attending a performance she had already seen the ending to. Kevin's lawyer adjusted a stack of documents and nodded toward the judge, clearly satisfied with the argument they had just presented. According to them, the story was simple. Kevin Parker was a talented software engineer who built a successful tech company. I was just his wife, a woman who had been around while the company happened. Nothing more. The judge glanced down at the notes in front of her before looking toward my side of the courtroom. "Mrs. Parker," she said calmly, "would your counsel like to respond?" My attorney placed a reassuring hand on the edge of the table. But before he could speak, I felt something inside me settle into place. It was strange how quiet my mind suddenly became. Not angry, not nervous, just clear. For 8 years, I had watched Kevin chase his dream. And for 8 years, I had believed we were chasing it together. But dreams have a way of revealing who people really are once they start coming true. Kevin believed the story began with his idea, but the truth was that our story began long before investors, offices, and marketing teams ever appeared. It began in a noisy exhibition hall in San Francisco. Back then, Kevin Parker was not the confident man sitting across the courtroom today. He was standing behind a folding table, nervously explaining his software to anyone willing to stop for more than 10 seconds. The booth was small: a laptop, a hand-printed banner, and a prototype of a business management platform that still crashed if you clicked the wrong button. I had been walking through the exhibition looking for potential clients. Freelance design work meant constantly meeting founders who needed help turning ideas into something real. Most booths looked polished. Kevin's did not. But something about the way he explained the system caught my attention. He spoke quickly, hands moving as he described how the platform would allow small businesses to manage their inventory and track customer information in one place. The concept was strong, but the product looked like it had been designed in a rush. The interface was cluttered. The color scheme was harsh. The logo looked like a placeholder. When Kevin finished his explanation, he looked at me expectantly. "So?" he asked. I hesitated for a moment before answering honestly. "The idea is good," I said, "but no one will take it seriously if it looks like this." Kevin blinked. Then he leaned closer to the laptop screen. "What do you mean?" "For the next 20 minutes, I explained everything I would change. The layout, the user flow, the visual branding, how investors often judged a startup in the first 10 seconds of seeing it. Kevin listened without interrupting. When I finally finished, he stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he turned back to me. Could you fix it? The way he asked the question made me laugh. Do you mean professionally? I said. Kevin rubbed the back of his neck. I mean, I can't afford a professional right now. That was the truth of Kevin Parker at the time. He had talent. He had ambition. But money was something he definitely did not have. Still, something about the project interested me. So a few days later, we met at a small cafe to review the platform together. That meeting turned into another, and then another. Before long, I was spending evenings redesigning Kevin's software interface and building a proper visual identity for the startup. A new logo, a clean dashboard layout, a website that made the product look credible. Kevin handled the code. I handled everything people would see when they first encountered the company. At first, it felt like a collaboration between two people chasing the same possibility. Kevin's apartment slowly transformed into something that looked more like a startup workspace than a living space. Whiteboards covered the walls. Cables ran across the floor. Stacks of notebooks and prototype sketches filled every surface. We spent long nights discussing features, users, and how the system could scale if the company ever found real customers. Those nights were exhausting, but they were also exciting. Because every small improvement made the idea feel a little more real. Then reality began arriving in the form of bills. Running a software platform costs money. Server hosting, development tools, cloud storage. Kevin had been paying for everything from his engineering salary. But as the project grew, the expenses grew with it. One evening, Kevin stared at the screen showing his bank account balance and shook his head. This thing is going to bankrupt me before it even launches. I looked at the numbers over his shoulder. He wasn't wrong. Without better equipment and stable hosting, the platform wouldn't survive its first serious users. So I started helping cover the costs. At first it was small, paying for hosting upgrades, buying a better monitor so Kevin could work more efficiently. Then came the bigger things. Server subscriptions, software licenses, eventually even parts of his rent when freelance work paid well that month. Kevin always promised he would repay me once the company started making money. But I never kept track of the amounts. Because at the time, I believed we were investing in something together. Not just financially, but emotionally. Back then, Kevin talked about the company as something we were building. Our platform. Our future. Our startup. Those words mattered to me. They made the long nights and financial stress feel like part of a shared journey. Looking back now, I realized something important. The moment Kevin's company became successful wasn't the moment our story changed. The moment our story changed was when Kevin stopped saying our and started saying my. Kevin quit his job on a rainy Thursday. I remember the exact day because the apartment smelled like burned coffee and overheated electronics. And Kevin had been staring at the resignation email on his laptop screen for almost an hour. His finger hovered above the send button. If I do this, he said quietly, there's no going back. I leaned against the kitchen counter watching him. For months he had been trying to balance two lives. During the day he worked as a software engineer for a mid-sized tech company in Chicago. At night he coded his own platform. Sometimes until 3 a.m. Sleep had become optional. Weekends had disappeared. And even with all that effort, progress was painfully slow. Your job is slowing you down, I said. Kevin nodded. But the job is also the only reason we can afford to live. That was the truth. Startups didn't produce income in the beginning. They consumed it. Servers needed to run constantly. New features required tools and subscriptions. Testing environments cost money. Even small things like domain renewals and cloud storage quietly added up. Kevin turned the laptop toward me. If I quit, everything depends on the company working. I knew what he meant. If he walked away from that job, someone else would have to carry the financial weight of both of our lives. Rent, utilities, food. Every dollar required to keep the company alive while it tried to become something real. I looked at the resignation email on the screen. Then I looked back at Kevin. "You should send it?" I said. Kevin stared at me. "You're serious? If you keep doing this halfway, you'll always wonder what would have happened if you gave it everything." For a moment he didn't move. Then he took a breath and pressed send. The email disappeared. And just like that, our lives quietly changed. 2 weeks later, Kevin officially left his job. From that moment on, the company became his full-time world. And I became the person holding up everything around it. My routine shifted almost overnight. During the day, I continued working at a design agency downtown. Most of our clients were small startups trying to look bigger than they actually were. I designed logos, marketing decks, and websites for founders who believed presentation could convince investors their ideas mattered. In the evenings, I switched to freelance projects. Sometimes branding packages, sometimes website layouts, sometimes simple graphic work that paid quickly. And on weekends, I began teaching beginner design courses online. 3 different income streams, all to keep one fragile startup alive. Kevin spent nearly every hour coding. I often woke up in the middle of the night to find the glow of his laptop still lighting the living room. Lines of code filled the screen, while empty coffee cups surrounded his desk. He looked exhausted most of the time, but he also looked determined. Every new feature brought a brief moment of excitement. "Look at this," he would say, calling me over to the computer. "This part lets businesses track inventory automatically." Or he would point at a dashboard. "Now they can see all their customer orders in one place." The platform slowly evolved from a rough prototype into something more structured. While Kevin built the engine, I built the face of the company. I redesigned the interface to make it clean and intuitive. I created a brand identity that looked professional instead of improvised. I built the website that explained the product clearly enough for investors to understand its potential. Sometimes Kevin used my design work during startup networking events. Sometimes he showed the website to potential partners. Every time someone said the platform looked impressive, I felt a quiet sense of pride, because I knew how different it looked compared to the first version I saw in that exhibition hall. But as the company slowly improved, something else began changing too. Kevin started referring to the business differently. At first it was subtle. When he spoke to people about the platform, he began saying my company, my system, my software. I noticed it during one small networking event where Kevin was presenting the product to a group of founders. After his presentation, someone asked how he had built the platform so quickly. Kevin laughed lightly. "I've been working on it non-stop for almost 2 years." That was technically true, but I stood in the back of the room thinking about the late nights redesigning interfaces, the weekends teaching classes so we could pay for server hosting, the freelance projects that paid for Kevin's equipment upgrades. None of that appeared in the story Kevin was telling. After the event, I mentioned it to him casually. "You said you built everything yourself." Kevin shrugged. "Well, I wrote the system. You didn't mention the design work." Kevin smiled. "You know what I meant." Maybe he did. But that was the first moment something inside me shifted slightly. Not anger, just awareness. Still, I pushed the thought away, because the company still felt fragile. And in fragile moments, partnerships required trust. 2 years into building the startup, Kevin proposed. The proposal wasn't elaborate. No expensive restaurant. No dramatic speech. Just the 2 of us sitting in the apartment after midnight while Kevin closed his laptop. He reached into his pocket and placed a small ring on the table. "I know things are messy right now," he said, "but when this company succeeds, everything will be different." I looked at the ring. "Different how?" Kevin smiled. "You won't have to work so hard anymore." That promise sounded beautiful in that moment. So I said yes. We married a few months later in a small courthouse ceremony. A few friends attended. No big celebration. Just a quiet commitment between 2 people building something uncertain. Back then, I believed the hardest part of our journey was the struggle. The sleepless nights. The financial stress. The endless work required to keep the company alive. But the truth was something I didn't understand yet. The real test of a partnership doesn't happen during failure. It happens when success finally arrives. Because success reveals which parts of the past people choose to remember, and which parts they decide to forget. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting at the small desk in our apartment finishing a freelance logo design when Kevin's name flashed across my screen. His voice exploded through the speaker before I could even say hello. They said yes. For a moment I had no idea what he meant. Who said yes? The investors, Kevin said, almost breathless. The firm in New York. They're putting $8 million into the company. The words felt unreal. $8 million. For years, the startup had survived on scraped-together savings, late payments, and hope. The idea that real investors now believed in the company was almost impossible to process. I stood up slowly, pressing the phone closer to my ear. Are you serious? Kevin laughed. I told you it would happen. That day, everything changed. Within weeks, the company stopped being a fragile experiment and started becoming something recognizable as a real business. Kevin signed the investment agreement with the venture capital firm. And suddenly the platform we had built in a cramped apartment had funding, expectations, and a future. The company moved into an office in downtown Chicago. Glass walls, long work tables, a conference room with screens larger than the television we had at home. I remember walking into that office for the first time and feeling a strange mix of pride and disbelief. Employees were already sitting at desks, reviewing code and discussing updates. The company had people now, real staff. Kevin stood near the center of the room explaining product features to 2 new developers. When he noticed me, he waved me over. "This is Emily," he told them. "My wife?" They smiled politely and returned to their screens. The introduction was brief. At the time, I told myself that was normal. But later I realized something. Kevin didn't mention the early days. He didn't say I helped design the platform. He didn't say I built the company's entire visual identity. He just said my wife. The transformation of Kevin Parker happened quickly after the investment. The hoodies and worn sneakers disappeared. Tailored suits replaced them. Instead of coding alone in the apartment at midnight, Kevin began attending technology conferences, networking events, and investor meetings. He was suddenly surrounded by people who called him a founder, a visionary, an entrepreneur. Podcast invitations started arriving. Tech blogs asked for interviews about the company's rapid growth. Everywhere Kevin went, people wanted to hear the story of how the startup began. And every time Kevin told that story, it started the same way, with an idea I had. That was how the narrative began. Not with the apartment full of cables and empty coffee cups. Not with the freelance work that kept our lights on. Just the idea. At first I didn't question it. Kevin was the one writing the code. He was the founder. That was the title the business world recognized. But as the company grew, I noticed something else. Kevin was building a team around himself. Product managers arrived first, then software engineers, then sales staff. The company needed people to handle the parts of growth Kevin didn't have time for anymore. One afternoon I asked him casually while we were walking through the office, "Are you planning to create a design department too?" Kevin looked at me briefly. "We'll probably outsource most of that." I blinked. "You know I can handle that." Kevin smiled quickly. "I know you can, but you don't need to work here. You've already done enough." At first that sounded generous, almost thoughtful. But as I walked back to the elevator later that day, the words echoed strangely in my mind. You don't need to work here. The company that had consumed years of my life was suddenly something Kevin thought I should stay away from. I told myself I was overthinking it. The company was growing quickly. Kevin had pressure from investors. Maybe he simply didn't want our marriage mixed with the business. That explanation made sense. Until the day Kevin introduced Hannah Brooks. She arrived during a Monday morning meeting in the conference room. Kevin stood beside her as the team gathered around the long table. "This is Hannah," he said. "She's joining us to lead digital marketing." Hannah looked exactly like someone investors would expect to see running a company's marketing strategy. Confident, polished. Her voice was smooth and professional, as she began outlining a plan to expand the company's online presence. She talked about brand positioning, user growth strategies, investor perception. Kevin watched her presentation with clear admiration. When the meeting ended, he introduced us. Emily, this is Hannah. Hannah shook my hand with a warm smile. I've heard a lot about the early days of the company, she said. That must have been exciting. It was chaotic, I said. She laughed lightly. Startups always are. At that moment, she just seemed like another talented professional joining the company. Someone whose skills complemented Kevin's technical leadership. For a while, that's all I believed she was. But over the next few months, Kevin's schedule started changing again. Late meetings became more common. Marketing strategy sessions, he explained. Business trips increased. Investor events. Technology conferences. Networking dinners. Hannah's name appeared frequently in Kevin's stories about work. Hannah thinks we should launch a new campaign. Hannah says our messaging needs to target larger businesses. It all sounded like normal collaboration. Until one evening when I stopped by the office unexpectedly. Kevin had texted earlier saying he would be working late again. So I picked up takeout on my way home and decided to bring him dinner. The office lights were mostly off when I arrived. Only a few rooms still glowed through the glass walls. Kevin's office was one of them. I walked down the hallway quietly. Through the glass door I could see Kevin and Hannah standing beside his desk. They were leaning over his laptop screen reviewing something. But what caught my attention wasn't the work. It was the distance between them. Or rather, the lack of it. They were standing closer than two coworkers usually stand. Kevin laughed at something Hannah said. The kind of relaxed laugh I hadn't heard from him in weeks. For a moment, neither of them noticed me. Then Kevin turned his head slightly and saw me in the hallway. The smile disappeared from his face almost instantly. Emily, he said, opening the door. What are you doing here? I brought dinner, I said quietly, holding up the bag. Hannah stepped back politely. Oh, I should probably head out, she said. Kevin nodded. Yeah, we're done here anyway. She gave me another friendly smile as she left. The hallway felt strangely quiet after she walked away. Kevin took the food from my hand and placed it on the desk. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know. I looked at the laptop screen where their marketing plans were still open. Working late again. Kevin shrugged. Startup life. Maybe that was true. But as I watched Kevin sit down to eat, something inside me whispered a thought I tried hard to ignore. Success had changed many things about Kevin. His schedule. His priorities. The people surrounding him. But the most dangerous change might have been the way success had started pulling him away from the person who had been there before any of it existed. Kevin stopped coming home at predictable hours. At first it happened occasionally. A late meeting here, a conference dinner there, investor calls that stretched longer than expected. That was normal in a growing startup. At least that was what I kept telling myself. The company had grown quickly after the investment. And Kevin suddenly carried the responsibility of employees, investors, and expectations far larger than anything we had imagined during those early nights in the apartment. Pressure changes people. I knew that. But pressure didn't explain everything. The first change I noticed was how carefully Kevin started guarding his phone. For years, his phone had been something that lived casually on the kitchen counter or the couch beside him. Now it was always with him. If a message arrived, he checked it immediately. If the screen lit up while I was nearby, he flipped the phone over without looking. Once or twice I walked into the room while he was typing something and watched him quickly lock the screen before placing the phone down. The behavior was subtle, not obvious enough to accuse, but obvious enough to notice. One night we were eating dinner when his phone buzzed beside his plate. Kevin glanced at it quickly. Then he picked it up and typed a response before continuing the conversation like nothing had happened. Work? I asked casually. Yeah, he said. What kind? Marketing stuff. I nodded and continued eating. But a small voice inside me had already begun asking questions. The business trips became more frequent too. San Francisco, New York, Austin. Every couple of weeks, Kevin seemed to have another conference or investor meeting that required travel. Sometimes Hannah attended those events as part of the company's marketing strategy. At least that was the explanation Kevin gave. One evening, while he packed a suitcase for another trip, I asked without looking up from my laptop, "Are you and Hannah presenting together again?" Kevin zipped the suitcase and shrugged. "Probably. You two seem to travel a lot for the same conferences." She handles the brand messaging. Investors care about that. The answer sounded reasonable. But something about the way he avoided eye contact while saying it left an uncomfortable silence in the room. I tried not to let the thought grow, because suspicion can destroy relationships even when nothing is wrong. But then one night everything shifted. Kevin had returned from a long networking event with investors. He was exhausted. After barely saying a few words, he collapsed onto the couch and fell asleep almost instantly. His laptop sat open on the coffee table beside him, still glowing with unread emails. I moved quietly through the living room, picking up empty glasses and turning off the lights. Kevin's phone rested loosely in his hand. I had no intention of touching it. I wasn't the kind of person who searched through someone else's private messages. But as I passed the couch, the phone screen suddenly lit up. A notification appeared across the lock screen. The message preview was impossible to miss. "Hannah." I froze. The words glowed clearly in the dim room. "I reserved our table at the old restaurant. Same quiet corner we like." For a few seconds I simply stared at the screen. My mind didn't immediately process what I was reading. "Reserved our table. Same quiet corner." The message didn't sound like business planning. It sounded familiar. Personal. Intimate. Kevin shifted slightly on the couch but didn't wake up. I slowly sat down in the chair across from him, the message still burning in my thoughts. For 8 years I had supported Kevin without hesitation. When people doubted his startup, I defended him. When money ran low, I worked harder. When the company nearly collapsed during the early years, I reminded him why he started. I believed in Kevin even when the world didn't. And now the glowing phone screen suggested that while I had been building the foundation of his dream, he had been building something else. I didn't wake him. I didn't confront him. Instead, I gently slid the phone back into his hand and turned off the living room lights. Because something about that moment made one thing very clear. If I reacted emotionally, Kevin would simply deny everything. And if I wanted the truth, I needed to understand what was really happening first. The next few weeks became a strange kind of quiet investigation. Not deliberate spying, just observation. Kevin mentioned Hannah constantly when talking about the company. Hannah thinks we should shift our messaging. Hannah says investors respond better to this strategy. Hannah booked a meeting with a potential partner. Her name appeared everywhere. Emails, company announcements, marketing updates. I also noticed something else. Whenever Kevin traveled for work, Hannah often seemed to be in the same city. Sometimes I learned this accidentally through social media posts from other startup founders attending the same events. Sometimes Kevin mentioned it casually. "Hannah's presenting tomorrow." Individually, none of those details proved anything. But together they formed a pattern that became harder to ignore. Then one night the pattern finally broke open. Kevin told me he had to fly to New York again for an investor meeting. I nodded and wished him luck. The next evening I was scrolling through my phone when I saw a photo posted by someone attending a technology networking event. The picture showed a crowded restaurant filled with startup founders. In the background, sitting at a corner table, were Kevin and Hannah. They were leaning toward each other across the table, laughing. And the restaurant looked very familiar, because it matched the one mentioned in the message I had seen weeks earlier. "Reserved our table. Same quiet corner we like." I stared at the image for a long time before setting my phone down. The strange thing was that I didn't feel shocked. Not really. Because somewhere deep down, I had already known. The message on Kevin's phone hadn't destroyed our marriage. It had simply confirmed what was already happening. But what I didn't understand yet was that the real betrayal wasn't the affair. The real betrayal was something Kevin was planning that would come later. Something that would turn our entire marriage into a legal strategy he believed would leave me with nothing. Kevin moved out on a rainy Thursday morning. There had been no dramatic fight the night before. No shouting. No broken dishes. Just a quiet conversation that felt strangely rehearsed. He stood in the living room with his jacket already on while I leaned against the kitchen counter, arms folded. "I think we both know this isn't working anymore," he said calmly. The sentence sounded like something memorized from a script. I watched the rain sliding down the apartment windows before answering. "Is this about Hannah?" Kevin didn't look surprised that I knew her name. He simply sighed. "Emily, things have changed." "That's not an answer." He rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding my eyes. "I didn't plan for any of this." "Didn't you?" Kevin finally looked up. "There's someone else now." The words landed softly in the room. No anger. No defensiveness. Just quiet confirmation. I nodded once. "I know." Kevin looked briefly confused. "You know, I've known for weeks." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Kevin glanced around the apartment, almost as if seeing it for the first time in years. "I think it's best if we separate," he said. "Best for who?" "For both of us." The rain outside grew heavier. Kevin reached for the suitcase standing near the door. "I've already arranged another place to stay." Of course he had. That realization hurt more than the confession itself. The decision had clearly been made long before this conversation. He paused near the door, as if waiting for some kind of reaction. But I didn't give him one. I simply watched as he picked up the suitcase and stepped into the hallway. The door closed behind him with a quiet click. 8 years of marriage ended without drama. Just silence. 2 weeks later, the legal papers arrived. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a design project when the courier knocked. The envelope was thick and formal. The words printed across the top were impossible to ignore. Petition for dissolution of marriage. I opened the packet slowly and began reading. Kevin had already hired a divorce attorney. The documents were prepared carefully, every detail organized with clinical precision. But one section made my hands pause on the paper. The financial settlement proposal. Kevin's legal team described our marriage in language that felt disturbingly incomplete. According to the filing, Kevin Parker was the sole founder and owner of a successful technology company. Emily Parker, his wife, had no formal employment relationship with the company. No ownership shares. No executive role. No contractual contributions. The proposal suggested a financial settlement equivalent to several months of Kevin's salary. It was presented as a generous offer. The message between the lines was clear. In the legal version of our marriage, I had simply been a supportive spouse. Nothing more. I read that paragraph 3 times before placing the papers down. The apartment felt very quiet. 8 years of work had been reduced to a few dismissive sentences written by someone who had never met me. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. "Kevin," I answered after a moment. "I assume you received the documents?" he said. "I did. Good. My lawyer said it's a straightforward process." Straightforward. That word almost made me laugh. "You really believe I contributed nothing to the company?" Kevin hesitated briefly. "Emily, legally speaking." "I'm not asking about legally speaking." The silence stretched on the line. Finally, Kevin sighed. "You helped in the beginning." "I've never denied that."
But
the company grew because of the technology. Because of the code." I leaned back in the chair, studying the quiet room around me. "So the years I paid our rent, the servers, the software tools, the branding, that doesn't count." Kevin's voice hardened slightly. "That wasn't an investment. That was supporting your husband. And now we're moving on with our lives." The simplicity of his tone was almost impressive. Kevin truly believed the story he was telling. A founder who built a company, a wife who watched from the sidelines. The conversation ended politely. No shouting. No threats. Just legal certainty. But a few days later, something unexpected happened. I received a message from someone I hadn't heard from in years. Marcus Hill, an attorney I had worked with long ago during a freelance branding project. He specialized in startup law. When I called him back, he sounded curious. "I heard about the divorce," Marcus said. "Word travels fast." "It does in Chicago." I hesitated before asking the question that had been quietly forming in my mind since the legal papers arrived. If someone financially supports a startup during the early stages, does that ever count as ownership? Marcus chuckled softly. That depends on the paperwork. What kind of paperwork? Investment agreements, equity contracts, partnership documents. And if none of those exist, then legally the founder owns the company. His answer was clear. Simple. And exactly what Kevin's lawyers were counting on. But as Marcus continued speaking, another memory surfaced in my mind. Something from years earlier. From a time when the company barely existed. A business trip to New York. A conversation in a small legal office. A document Kevin had signed without much thought. Marcus paused when I didn't respond. Emily? I'm here. You sound like you're remembering something. Maybe I was. Because Kevin believed the past was simple. A story about a brilliant founder and a supportive wife. But the truth about the early days of the company was much more complicated than that. And somewhere inside an old file folder in my apartment, there was a document that Kevin Parker had completely forgotten existed. A document that would change the story he was about to tell in court. I didn't sleep much that night. The memory of that old document kept circling in my mind like something half-buried that refused to stay forgotten. For years it had existed quietly in the background of my life. Something I had filed away without thinking I would ever need it. Back then, Kevin and I were still struggling. The company barely existed outside his laptop. We had traveled to New York because Kevin wanted to meet a potential advisor someone had introduced him to. The meeting itself had lasted less than an hour. But afterward, something else happened. Something that suddenly mattered again. The next morning, I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and began sorting through folders. Receipts. Old tax records. Freelance contracts. Documents from design projects that now felt like they belonged to another life. It took almost 40 minutes before I found the folder I was looking for. Plain manila. The corner slightly bent. Inside were a handful of legal papers from 8 years ago. I placed them carefully on the desk and sat down. For a moment, I didn't open the folder. Because once I confirmed what was inside, everything about the divorce Kevin had planned would change. Finally, I slid the papers out. The title across the first page was simple. Equity Contribution Agreement. My hands were steady as I flipped through the pages. Every detail returned instantly. The small legal office in Manhattan. The smell of fresh coffee on the conference table. Kevin sitting beside me looking impatient. At the time, Kevin had considered the meeting unnecessary. We were still living paycheck to paycheck. The company had no investors. No office. No employees. Just an idea and a lot of hope. But I had insisted. Startups fail all the time. I had told him that day. If we're putting our entire lives into this, we should protect ourselves. Kevin had laughed. Protect ourselves from what? We barely have anything. Still, he agreed to sign the paperwork, mostly because he didn't want to argue. The lawyer had explained everything carefully. Emily Parker would be listed as the initial financial contributor to the company. Any money she invested into the business, including personal savings used for living expenses that allowed Kevin to work full-time on development, would count as startup capital. In exchange, Emily Parker would hold 49% equity in the company. Not majority control, but almost half. At the time, Kevin had signed the document quickly, barely reading past the first page. Happy now, he had joked. I remembered smiling and sliding the contract into the folder. Back then, it had felt more symbolic than practical. A safety net we would probably never need. 8 years later, that safety net was sitting on my desk. And Kevin Parker had completely forgotten it existed. I studied the signatures at the bottom of the final page. Kevin Parker. Emily Parker. Witnessed and notarized in the state of New York. Everything was legally valid. Everything had been filed correctly. Which meant one thing. Kevin's lawyers had built their entire divorce strategy on a version of the past that wasn't legally accurate. I leaned back in the chair and let out a slow breath. The realization didn't bring satisfaction. Not yet. Just clarity. Kevin believed he had rewritten our history. But the law had recorded a different story years earlier. My phone buzzed on the desk. A message from Kevin. Lawyers are scheduling the hearing date next month. The confidence in that sentence was almost visible through the screen. Kevin believed the divorce was already decided. He believed the courtroom would simply confirm the story he had been telling everyone. I didn't reply. Instead, I reached for my phone and called Marcus Hill again. He answered on the second ring. "Emily, I found something." His tone changed immediately. "What kind of something?" "An equity agreement Kevin signed 8 years ago." There was a pause. "What percentage?" 49. Marcus didn't speak for several seconds. When he finally did, his voice sounded very different. "You're serious?" "Yes. Signed and notarized. In New York." Another pause. Then Marcus laughed softly. "Well, that changes things." "How much does it change?" "If the document is valid, you legally own 49% of the company." The number hung in the air between us. 49%. Almost half of the business Kevin believed belonged entirely to him. Marcus continued carefully. "Do Kevin's lawyers know about this?" "I don't think so." "Good." I could almost hear him leaning forward in his chair. "Because if they don't, then Kevin's entire legal argument in this divorce just collapsed." I closed the folder slowly. For weeks, Kevin had treated the divorce like a business negotiation he expected to win. He had hired expensive attorneys, prepared financial strategies, presented himself as the sole architect of the company's success. But Kevin had forgotten something important. He had forgotten the early days. The years when the company was fragile. When the future depended on someone believing in him. And 8 years ago, in a quiet office in Manhattan, Kevin Parker had signed a document that legally acknowledged exactly who that person was. The courtroom hearing was still weeks away. Kevin thought it would be a routine proceeding, a simple confirmation of the story he had already written. But when the judge opened the case file that day, the version of history Kevin planned to present would suddenly collide with a piece of paper he had signed long ago. And in that moment, the entire room would finally understand something Kevin had spent years trying to forget. The woman he claimed never worked a real job had legally owned nearly half of his dream all along. The courtroom in Chicago was colder than I expected. Not physically. Emotionally, everything about the room felt formal and distant. Dark wooden benches. Quiet murmurs from lawyers reviewing documents. The steady rhythm of the clerk organizing case files at the front. I sat beside Marcus Hill at the long table reserved for our side. Across the room, Kevin sat with his legal team. 3 attorneys, all wearing the confident expressions of people who believed the outcome was already clear. Kevin looked different from the man I had known during the early years of the startup. His suit was sharp, his posture relaxed. He looked like someone who had spent the last year surrounded by investors and success. Behind him, sitting quietly in the gallery, was Hannah Brooks. She wore a sleek black dress and watched the room calmly, as if this entire proceeding were simply another business meeting. For a moment our eyes met. She didn't look away. Instead, she gave a faint, polite smile. It was the same smile she had given me the day Kevin introduced us at the office. Professional. Controlled. Marcus leaned slightly toward me. "You okay?" "I'm fine. Remember, we wait until they finish their argument." I nodded. The judge entered the room and everyone stood. The case was called within minutes. Kevin's attorney approached the front first. He spoke clearly and confidently, outlining what he described as a straightforward divorce case. "Your Honor," he began, "this is a dissolution of marriage involving a technology entrepreneur whose company has recently experienced significant growth." He gestured toward Kevin. "My client, Mr. Kevin Parker, founded and built the company independently. His spouse, Emily Parker, was not an employee, investor, or shareholder in the business." The words were delivered smoothly, practiced. Kevin sat back in his chair while the lawyer continued explaining the financial proposal. According to the legal narrative they presented, Kevin had created the company from scratch. Emily had been supportive emotionally but had no formal role in its development. The attorney emphasized that Emily had never signed employment contracts with the company and had never held shares. Therefore, Kevin's legal team proposed a settlement based on marital support rather than ownership. When the lawyer finished, the judge glanced down at the documents. And Mrs. Parker's response, Marcus stood calmly. Your Honor, before addressing the settlement proposal, we would like to submit an additional document to the court. The room grew slightly quieter. Marcus placed a folder on the clerk's desk. This document predates the formation of Mr. Parker's current corporate structure. The judge adjusted her glasses and opened the file. Across the room, Kevin leaned forward slightly. Watching with mild curiosity, Marcus spoke again. It is an equity contribution agreement signed 8 years ago by both parties in New York. The judge turned the first page slowly. The silence in the room became noticeable. Kevin's attorney frowned. Your Honor, we have not seen this document before. Marcus nodded calmly. That's correct. Kevin shifted in his seat. The judge continued reading. Then she paused. Her eyes moved back to the top of the document. She read something again. Across the room, Kevin's expression changed slightly. Just a small movement at first. Confusion. The judge finally looked up. Mr. Parker. Kevin straightened. Yes. Your Honor, did you sign this agreement? The courtroom felt suddenly very still. Kevin glanced toward his lawyer, then back at the judge. I'm not sure. The judge tapped the signature at the bottom of the page. It appears to be your signature. Kevin leaned forward as the clerk handed him a copy. He stared at the document for several seconds. The color drained from his face. Yes, he said quietly. That's my signature. His attorney immediately stepped closer. Your Honor, we would like time to review this document. The judge nodded. Of course. Kevin's legal team gathered around the paper. They spoke in low, urgent voices. Marcus remained calm beside me. I watched Kevin as he read the document again. And again. Because now he remembered the small office in Manhattan. The casual conversation about protecting the future. The signature he had placed on the final page without thinking twice. 8 years ago, the company had been nothing more than an uncertain idea. And in that moment, Kevin had agreed to something he never expected would matter. Marcus finally spoke again. Your Honor, the agreement clearly states that Emily Parker provided initial financial contributions that allowed the company's development to begin. The judge nodded slowly as she reviewed the pages. And according to this document, Mrs. Parker holds 49% equity in the company. Kevin's attorney froze. The number echoed quietly through the room. 49%. Nearly half. The lawyer turned toward Kevin. You didn't tell us about this. Kevin didn't respond. Because the truth was painfully obvious now. He hadn't remembered. The judge placed the document carefully back on the desk. Well, she said calmly, that changes the nature of this case. Across the courtroom, Hannah's polite smile had completely disappeared. Kevin sat motionless in his chair, staring at the paper that had just dismantled the story he had built for months. The man who had stood confidently at the beginning of the hearing now looked like someone who had suddenly realized the ground beneath him was no longer stable. And the divorce Kevin believed would end with a small settlement was about to turn into something very different. Kevin's attorney asked the judge for a short recess. The request was granted almost immediately. The courtroom slowly emptied as lawyers and assistants stepped into the hallway, whispering urgently while reviewing documents. Kevin remained seated for a moment before finally standing. He looked toward my table. For the first time since the hearing began, there was no confidence left in his expression. Only shock. Marcus gathered the papers calmly while the clerk organized files at the front of the room. Let them panic, he murmured quietly. They didn't prepare for this. Across the room, Kevin's legal team huddled tightly around the equity agreement. One of the attorneys flipped through the pages rapidly. Another typed something quickly on a laptop. The third kept glancing toward me with an expression somewhere between disbelief and irritation. Finally, Kevin walked toward our table. His steps were slower than usual, as if the weight of the document had physically changed the way he moved. He stopped a few feet away. Emily, he said quietly. Marcus looked up. If you want to speak with my client, We'll do it here. Kevin nodded. He glanced at the folder still resting on the table. You kept it. His voice sounded strange. Not angry. Not defensive. Just stunned. I met his eyes. You signed it. Kevin ran a hand through his hair. That was 8 years ago. Yes. The company barely existed. That's exactly why we signed it. Kevin looked down at the document again. For several seconds he didn't say anything. Then he let out a quiet breath. I honestly forgot. Marcus folded his arms. That doesn't change its legal validity. Kevin turned toward him sharply. You're enjoying this? Marcus shrugged. I'm doing my job. Kevin looked back at me. You never mentioned this during the divorce discussions. You never asked. The answer landed heavily between us. Kevin opened his mouth as if preparing to argue. Then he stopped. Because arguing would only highlight the obvious truth. He had built his entire legal strategy around the assumption that Emily Parker had no claim to the company. And now the document sitting on the table said otherwise. Kevin's lawyer approached quickly. Kevin, we need to talk. He guided Kevin a few steps away. The conversation between them was quiet but intense. Even from across the room I could see the frustration in the lawyer's gestures. At one point the attorney tapped the equity agreement sharply with his finger. Kevin rubbed his forehead, clearly trying to process the consequences. Marcus leaned slightly toward me. Here's what's happening, he said quietly. They thought they were negotiating a divorce settlement. And now they're negotiating with a 49% shareholder. The difference was enormous. Without the agreement, Kevin controlled the company completely. But with the document recognized in court, ownership had suddenly shifted. Nearly half the business belonged to me. And if the divorce proceeded normally, Kevin could be forced to divide control in ways that might affect investors, corporate decisions, and the entire company structure. Kevin's lawyer returned a few minutes later. He addressed Marcus directly. We'd like to discuss a settlement. Marcus smiled faintly. Of course you would. The attorneys moved to a quieter corner of the courtroom. I watched Kevin pacing slowly near the window. He looked very different now. Not like the confident entrepreneur who had walked into court expecting a quick victory. More like the man I remembered from years earlier. The one who stayed awake at night worrying about whether his startup would survive. Eventually, Kevin approached me again. His voice was calmer this time. What do you want? The question wasn't aggressive. It sounded almost tired. Marcus answered before I could speak. My client legally owns 49% of the company. Kevin nodded slowly. I understand that if the case continues, Marcus continued, the court will recognize her ownership and divide assets accordingly. Kevin's jaw tightened. He knew what that meant. Investors hated uncertainty. If a divorce battle threatened the ownership structure of the company, it could damage everything he had built. What's the alternative? Kevin asked. Marcus folded his hands. You buy out her shares. Kevin laughed once under his breath. That would cost millions. Yes. Kevin glanced toward me. For years he had believed the company belonged entirely to him. Now he was being asked to purchase a large portion of something he thought he already owned. The irony was impossible to ignore. He rubbed his temples again. This wasn't supposed to happen. I studied his face quietly. You weren't supposed to forget. Kevin looked up. And for a moment something flashed across his expression. Not anger. Something closer to regret. But regret didn't change the situation. Kevin Parker had spent months preparing to walk away from our marriage with complete control of the company we built together. Now the legal reality was forcing him to face a different outcome. The man who had once told the courtroom that his wife never worked a real job was about to discover just how expensive that assumption could become. The negotiations moved into a private conference room beside the courtroom. The room was smaller, quieter, and somehow more intense than the public hearing had been. Kevin sat at one end of the table with his legal team. I sat across from him beside Marcus. For several minutes no one spoke. The equity agreement lay open in the center of the table like an undeniable fact everyone had to acknowledge. Kevin's lead attorney finally broke the silence. Let's discuss realistic options. Marcus leaned back calmly. That's what we're here for. Kevin looked exhausted now. The confident posture he had carried earlier in court was gone. He stared at the document again as if it might somehow disappear if he looked long enough. I want to understand something, he said quietly. He looked directly at me. Did you always plan to use this against me? The question hung in the room. I shook my head. No. Kevin frowned slightly. Then why keep it? Because we were building a company together. The answer seemed to confuse him. You trusted me enough to marry me. I continued. But I trusted the law more than luck. Marcus gave a small approving nod. Kevin looked down again. For a moment he didn't say anything. Then his lawyer cleared his throat. Kevin, the priority now is protecting the company. Everyone in the room understood what that meant. If the divorce became a prolonged legal battle over ownership, investors would panic. Corporate partners would hesitate. The company's valuation could collapse. Kevin's entire career was tied to the stability of that business. Marcus spoke carefully. My client is willing to resolve this without damaging the company. Kevin looked up. How? You buy her shares. Kevin exhaled slowly. That's still 49%. Yes. Kevin's lawyer slid a financial report across the table. The current valuation of the company places that stake at approximately $11 million. Even after hearing the number, I felt a small shock. 11 million. 8 years earlier, Kevin had signed the agreement while sitting in a tiny legal office because we barely had enough money to pay rent. Now the document was suddenly worth more than anything either of us had imagined. Kevin stared at the number for a long moment. Then he looked at Marcus. That valuation assumes continued investor confidence. Marcus shrugged. Which is exactly why dragging this into a long court fight would be a terrible idea. Kevin knew he was right. If the divorce turned into a public battle over ownership, investors might reconsider their involvement. Tech companies depended heavily on perception. Instability could destroy value overnight. Kevin rubbed his forehead again. So what are you asking for? Marcus slid another document across the table. A buyout agreement. Kevin's lawyer picked it up first. He scanned the pages quickly. His expression tightened. You're asking for $10 million. Marcus nodded calmly. A discounted settlement. Kevin gave a short, incredulous laugh. You call that a discount? It's significantly less than the equity valuation. Kevin leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment. The room remained silent. Finally, he sat forward again. I built this company. Marcus didn't argue. No one is denying that. Kevin looked toward me. You know how many nights I spent writing that code? Yes. You know how many times the platform nearly failed? I remember. Kevin shook his head slowly. This isn't fair. The words sounded almost childlike. I met his gaze. Neither was pretending I did nothing. The room grew quiet again. Kevin's lawyer spoke next. If we agree to this buyout, the divorce settlement must include a confidentiality clause. Marcus nodded. That's acceptable. Kevin looked between the two attorneys. So the story becomes simple, he said. Marcus tilted his head slightly. What story? That Emily supported the company early on and was compensated for it. That would be accurate. Kevin studied the document again. For several minutes, he didn't move. Then he reached for the pen lying beside the agreement. His attorney stopped him briefly. Kevin, are you sure? Kevin gave a tired smile. Do I have a better option? The lawyer didn't answer. Because everyone in the room already knew the truth. If Kevin refused the settlement, the court would continue examining the ownership agreement. And the longer that process lasted, the more unstable the company would become. Finally, Kevin signed. The pen scratched quietly across the page. $10 million. In exchange for 49% ownership. Marcus slid the agreement toward me. I read the final lines carefully. Then I signed as well. Just like that. 8 years of struggle, loyalty, betrayal, and legal maneuvering ended with 2 signatures on a sheet of paper. Kevin leaned back in his chair again. For the first time since the hearing began, he looked directly at me without anger. Just something quieter. You planned further ahead than I ever realized. I closed the folder slowly. No? Kevin raised an eyebrow. No. I just remembered something you forgot. Kevin looked down at the signed agreement again, and for the first time since our marriage began falling apart, he seemed to understand something important. Success hadn't been built by one person alone. It had been built by two, and now he had just paid $10 million to finally acknowledge that truth. The divorce was finalized quietly 2 weeks later. No dramatic courtroom scenes. No arguments. Just paperwork, signatures, and the official end of a marriage that had once been built on shared ambition. By the time the legal process concluded, the buyout agreement had already been transferred. $10 million sat in a newly opened business account under my name. The number still felt surreal. For years, money had been something I chased constantly. Freelance invoices, late payments, carefully planned grocery budgets. Now a single legal document had changed everything. But the strangest part wasn't the money. It was the silence. Kevin and I didn't speak again after signing the agreement. Not during the final court filings. Not when the funds were transferred. Not even when the divorce decree arrived in the mail. The story simply ended. Or at least that's how it looked from the outside. A few weeks after the divorce became official, Marcus called me with an unexpected suggestion. You ever thought about starting your own company? I laughed softly. I've been working freelance for years. That's basically a company. I'm not talking about freelance projects, Marcus said. I'm talking about something bigger. I leaned back in my chair. What kind of bigger? You helped build a startup once already, he said. You know how early companies struggle with branding? That part was true. Most founders focused on product development and ignored design entirely. Brand identity often became an afterthought. Marcus continued. You could build a studio that specializes in helping startups from day one. The idea sounded surprisingly familiar, because in many ways it described the role I had quietly played in Kevin's company during those early years. Logo design, user interface layout, brand messaging, investor presentation visuals. All the things Kevin once described in court as not real work. But every startup founder I had met over the years knew how important those details actually were. What would we call it? I asked. Marcus chuckled. You're the designer. A week later, I signed the lease for a small office space in downtown Chicago. Not a giant corporate building. Just a modest studio with tall windows overlooking a busy street. The space smelled like fresh paint and possibility. I spent the first few days setting up desks, computers, and sketchboards. The same kind of environment Kevin and I had once created in our apartment years earlier. Except this time the company belonged entirely to me. The studio's name was simple: Origin Design Lab. The idea behind it was even simpler. Every successful company begins somewhere small, and those early beginnings deserve professional support. Within a month, the first clients started arriving. A healthcare technology startup needed help designing their product interface. A financial app company wanted a complete brand identity. A small AI company asked for help creating investor presentation visuals. Each project reminded me of the chaotic early days of Kevin's startup. Except now I wasn't working quietly in the background. I was the founder. 6 months later, something unexpected happened. A journalist from Forbes contacted me. I'm writing a piece about founders who started companies after major life changes, she explained. Marcus mentioned your story. I hesitated. What part of my story? The part where you turned a divorce settlement into a business. The article was published 2 weeks later. The headline made me smile. From startup supporter to startup founder. The story didn't focus on Kevin's company. It focused on the idea that people who help build companies often understand entrepreneurship better than anyone else. The article spread quickly online. New clients began reaching out. Investors started asking questions. One evening I closed the studio late and walked outside into the cool Chicago air. The streetlights reflected softly against the windows of nearby buildings. For the first time in years I felt something I hadn't realized I had lost during my marriage. Freedom. Kevin Parker had once told a courtroom that his wife had never done any real work. And in a strange way, he had been right about one thing. The work I was doing now was different. Because for the first time, The dream I was building belonged entirely to me. The first anniversary of Origin Design Lab arrived quietly. There was no giant celebration, no flashy party, just a small gathering in the studio with the people who had helped build the company during its first year. The office looked different now. The once empty room with 2 desks had slowly transformed into a creative space filled with activity. Design boards covered the walls. 3 long work tables were occupied by a small team of designers and developers. Whiteboards were filled with sketches for client projects. The quiet studio I had rented 12 months earlier had become a living, growing company. I stood near the window watching the evening traffic move through downtown Chicago. The city lights reflected across the glass buildings, creating a calm glow across the street. Behind me, I could hear laughter from the team as they talked about one of our newest clients. A health technology startup had just secured funding after presenting a product interface our studio helped design. Moments like that still felt surreal. Not because the work was new to me, but because this time the success belonged to something I had built from the beginning. Someone tapped gently on my shoulder. It was Olivia, the first designer I hired 6 months earlier. "You're doing that thing again," she said with a small smile. "What thing?" The quiet reflection stare out the window. I laughed softly. "Am I that obvious?" "A little." She handed me a cup of coffee. "People inside are arguing about whether we should expand the office next year. That's a good problem." "It is." She looked around the studio. "You built something really special here." For a moment I didn't answer, because hearing those words triggered an old memory. 8 years earlier, I had stood in a tiny apartment filled with computer cables and design sketches. Kevin had been sitting at a small desk writing the first version of the software that would eventually become his company. Back then, we had both believed we were building the future together. And in many ways we had. The difference was that time had revealed something neither of us fully understood in those early days. Dreams don't belong to the loudest voice in the room. They belong to the people who help build them. Olivia studied my expression. "You're thinking about the past again, aren't you? Maybe a little regret." I shook my head. "Perspective." She smiled. "I like that answer." The team gathered near the center table as someone brought out a small cake from a nearby bakery. Nothing fancy. Just a simple chocolate cake with white frosting. On the top, someone had written, "Year 1." Everyone applauded as the candles were lit. I stood there watching the people around the table. Designers, developers, writers. People who had joined the studio because they believed in building something from the ground up. For a moment, the room reminded me of the early days of another startup. Except this time, something felt different. There was no hierarchy of credit. No quiet contributors working behind the scenes while someone else told the story. Everyone here knew exactly how important their role was. After the cake was cut and the celebration slowly faded into relaxed conversation, I stepped outside again for some fresh air. Chicago was calm that night. The city hummed softly with late evening energy. I leaned against the railing outside the studio and watched people walking along the sidewalk below. Some of them were probably heading home after long workdays. Some were meeting friends. Some were chasing dreams of their own. And somewhere out there, Kevin Parker was probably still running the company we once built together. Our paths had separated. But the lessons from those years remained. Because the truth about success is rarely simple. Sometimes the person standing in the spotlight forgets who helped turn on the lights in the first place. If there's one thing I learned from everything that happened, it's this. Never underestimate the quiet work happening behind the scenes. The long nights. The sacrifices. The belief someone holds when nobody else sees the potential yet. Those things may not always get immediate recognition. But sooner or later, the truth has a way of surfacing. Sometimes in a courtroom. Sometimes in a new beginning. And sometimes in the quiet moment when you realize the dream you helped build has finally become your own. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly supported a dream, take a second to share it with them. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, hidden strength, and the moments when the truth finally comes to light, consider subscribing to the channel and staying with us for the next story. Because sometimes the most powerful victories don't begin with revenge. They begin with remembering your own worth. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.